Welcome to the PROPOLIS REDCap database video training. This training will give you an overview of the REDCap database that's set up for the PROPOLIS study. And after watching this video, you'll be able to assign a participant ID in REDCap, randomize a participant, and enter data using the PROPOLIS REDCap database. So the PROPOLIS Data Center team is located at the University of Washington and led by Dagmar Amtman. My name is Kara McMullen, and if you have any questions at any time, please contact me at mcmulk@uw.edu. So this training will give you an overview of the REDCap database, like I already said, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen in REDCap, which will look a little different than yours will. And as the very first note, I should say that even if you've used REDCap before, and even if you have an institutional logon, we have a separate instance of REDCap for the PROPOLIS database. So you'll need to email me to get a username and ID set up so that you can get into our REDCap instance. So if you've used REDCap before, this should be fairly straightforward for you. But if you've never used REDCap, the first thing you'll want to do is watch a couple of the REDCap training videos, which are training videos that the Vanderbilt University REDCap team has created for people who are new to REDCap. So when you log in, you won't have any of these projects set up because you'll only have the PROPOLIS projects here. But you will have these tabs at the top. And so if you've never done REDCap before, you'll want to go to the training videos tab, and you'll want to at least do the brief overview and the data entry overview of these training videos in REDCap. If you've done REDCap before, you don't need to watch those videos, especially if you feel fairly proficient and know your way around a REDCap database. But the training videos can be handy, and if you're interested in REDCap, it's a good resource for learning more about REDCap. So I'm going to show you the PROPOLIS database. The first thing that you'll want to know about, and which I have already discussed on the other video training, and which is also shown on our PDF training of how to assign a participant ID, which is stored on the Center PROPOLIS Training Resources tab, is, I will share this quickly with you. The record ID is site_ID number. So the site numbers are 1 for USAIR, 2 for UAB, 3 for UW, 4 for VU, 5 for UTMB, and 6 for UT Southwest. So I'm going to do a mock data entry into REDCap to show you how to use the database. And we do have a separate data center site set up. So I will be using that, which is 7. So I'll say 7_1, and I will be setting up the first participant ID for the REDCap database for our data center testing site. So to enter that new ID, all you do is enter your site number _ the participant ID number. Again, you can assign that sequentially. So for the first person who you're entering a record for, it could be number 1. And then you just hit enter. And now you have a record ID for that participant, and you have all the forms at admission that you need to fill out for every participant. So for the first form in REDCap, it mirrors the data collection forms. So you have demographics, which is also the first things that are shared, that are shown on the paper data collection forms. So I'll hit data center website, I'll enter my name, and I'll say that this mock participant was screened today at 8:05 a.m. And it is a 24-hour clock that we're using for all times that we're entering for the PROPOLIS database. We'll say that this person was admitted to the BICU today. And we'll say that their date of birth was 1/10/1999. And actually, that's a good point. As you can see, if I enter that, REDCap won't allow you to do it because it's a data entry error. So I'll take that out and then And then that should be allowed right there. So time to admission, perhaps they were admitted at 7 and they would be 22 years old, male. On all REDCap forms, we want to call everything complete once you've had the data fully entered into REDCap. And then as you can see, once you hit complete and hit save and exit, that radio button will show up as green, which tells you that it's completed and all the data entry for that form is done. So here we fill out the injury information, which we'll say was 6. I'm just making up some numbers here, but we'll say 32% with 12% full thickness. And it was a flame burn. We'll say none. And some of these things in REDCap, some items have field notes that have some more information for you if you need some help in filling out the data collection. For example, in this one, if there was more than one non-thermal injury, separate with a semicolon. Again, we want to mark complete and save and exit the form. Next is inclusion criteria. And similarly to the paper data collection forms, each answer must be yes in order for the patient to be eligible for PROPOLIS. So we fill out yes, say complete, save and exit the form, and that one also will show up as green on the radio button for the admission time point. For the exclusion criteria, each answer should be no for the participant to be eligible for the study, i.e. if you answer yes to at least one exclusion criteria, the participant is not eligible for the study. If you get to this point and have them entered into REDCap but realize that they are not eligible for the study, you can save the information here as you filled it out, and then you don't need to enter any additional information. And in fact, because we don't actually need a record of everybody who was not eligible in REDCap, you don't need to save the record. And if you want to reuse their ID, you can let me know and I can delete that record out of REDCap. We don't need to delete the record out of REDCap because we have the data. So if you, for example, you marked yes that they had a chemical injury, we know that on the database side, and so we don't actually need to delete the record. We just not include anyone in any of the statistics that we're summarizing who weren't eligible. But for kind of record keeping sake, you might want to just delete the data out of REDCap. And because you don't have the ability to actually delete a record once you create it, you'll have to let me know and I will go in and delete that record. So again, if someone is not eligible for the PROPOLIS study, they don't even need to have a REDCap record. And if you do end up making a record for them and then determining that they're ineligible, you can let me know and I'll delete that record from REDCap. But this participant who we are mock entering data for is eligible for the study, so I'll answer no for all of these items. And then I'll mark that record as complete and save and exit the form. For consent, we enter information here once they've been approached for consent. And so we'll say yes here. And then we'll say that they did indicate intent to consent, or they already consented via paper forms. It was the patient, and e-consent in this case is not needed. There is a separate video training and PDF training for using e-consent in REDCap, and that training will walk you through whether, if you decide that you are going to use e-consent, or if the participant indicates that they'd like to use e-consent, that training will walk you through how to do that. And real quick, just to show you what happens if the patient actually wasn't approached for consent because of whatever reason. You'd indicate no here, and then because of branching logic, another question comes up which says, please indicate why they weren't approached for consent. And so perhaps they were missed because their legally authorized representative was not available. So you'd fill that out, mark it as complete, and then save the form, and that's all that you need to save in REDCap. And again, this information has been covered in other trainings, but just as a reminder, people who were eligible but did not consent, we do need a record for them in REDCap. So unlike people who weren't eligible, we do want information for people who did not consent in REDCap. So in this case, if the LER was not available, we'd save and exit the form, and you'd be done with this record. You could go add a new record if you had more paper data entry forms to fill out. So I'll say I'll enter another record here, or you can be done with REDCap if that was all the paper data entry or all the data entry you had to do in REDCap. So I will go back into that first mock entry record I had, which is 7-1, and this is how you go back into a record that you've already entered into REDCap. You enter their ID and it will show here, and then you can just go back in and it will have all the data you've already saved. So when you go back into REDCap the second time, it will show all the time points for PROPOLIS data collection. And so you can view the REDCap database either way. You can view it all times at once, or you can go up to this drop-down box and say that you just want to focus on admission. So for right now, I'm just going to focus on the admission time point. And I will go back to consent because we're going to change the data entry here and say that this mock participant was approached for consent and that they did consent. They consented themselves. We don't need e-consent, and they consented today. I will mark that as complete, save and exit, and then we will move on. So the next form in REDCap is randomization, and this is where you'll determine the randomization group for the participant. So this particular participant was 32% TBSA, so they're in the 20 to 34% TBSA category, and you do use the total burn size here rather than just either full or partial thickness. We want the total burn size for the TBSA category. So I'll enter that, hit randomize, and then because we're randomizing and we only get one shot at it, REDCap has you review your information to make sure that it's correct. So you'll want to review the TBSA category and your site to make sure that that data is entered correctly. And then you'll randomize. This participant has been assigned to the control resuscitation, and you'd mark that in your paper data collection form, and you also have it stored here in REDCap, so you can go back and check what group they were randomized to in REDCap. So we'd mark that as complete, save and exit, and that form is done. So the rest of the admission form follows the same format as the PROPOLIS paper data collection forms that I've already covered on a different video training. We'll walk through admission information, blood sample, pre-BICU, intake and output, and so on. And the one thing I wanted to point out is that for the paper data collection forms, which are set up so that some of the data is represented as table form rather than just one time point at a time. So I will go up and find one of those. So for example, ventilator data. So we have an admission time point for ventilator data. And if I go back to the REDCap database, you can see here that I can go to ventilator data and fill out that information as it is on the paper data collection form. But this way it's just the one time point rather than a table like it is on the paper data collection form. So I'd fill out the date, the time. They're not in the OR. 49%. We'll say ventilator mode is VC. No. And we'd fill out the rest of the information here. Mark it as complete and save and exit the form. It's up to you when you want to do the REDCap data entry. If you have all the paper data collected on the paper data collection form and decide that you just want to do data entry all at once, you can do that, or you can do it after you have the data collected for each time point. If you do have the data collected and you're doing data entry all at once, it might be easier to view all time points. And then, for example, you can just enter the ventilator data all at once. So I just did admission, and then I'd go to hour 6 and fill out that information by looking at hour 6 of the data collection form, hour 6 hours post burn hour. I'd fill that out, and then I'd go back to REDCap. I'd have all this filled out, and then I'd move on to hour 12 and so on. So by pivoting back and forth between the time points that you're viewing, you can kind of decide how best data entry works for you. There's a couple of tips and tricks for data entry. One of them is that you can press tab, and that takes you to the next data entry item on REDCap. So for this, for example, I'm on the admission vital signs, and so I'll say the systolic blood pressure was 159. I hit tab and it takes me to the next item without having to click my mouse down to there. So that's one way that you can speed up data entry. As soon as you're done with each data form, mark it as complete. Another thing you can use for your kind of own data entry process is you can use this unverified or incomplete form status. So if you only have blood pressure, but you wanted to start the record and you decided to just enter admission blood pressure for this participant, but you don't have any of the other vital signs right now, you can hit incomplete, save and exit, and then it shows up as red, and that will remind you when you come back to the record that you have more data to enter there. And so what you want to do is have all of this information. Once you have all the information on the paper data collection form, you'll want all of these radio buttons to show up as green on REDCap, and that's when you know that you'll be done with data entry for that participant. A couple of other notes is each time point does have an adverse event log and an unanticipated problems log. You only need to fill those out if there was an AE, an SAE, i.e. an adverse event or a severe adverse event or an unanticipated problem to report. So for your own records, you can say yes here. Excuse me, you can say no here if there were no AEs or SAEs to mark down, and then save it as incomplete and move on. And so these two forms down here will be the only forms in REDCap that will either be blank or red when you're completed with data entry if there aren't any adverse events or unanticipated problems to log. If there are adverse events, you'll mark them down here, and you do have to have your site PI name and signature. So you'll have your PI review the record in REDCap, and you'll add the signature. They'll add their signature here, save their signature. And then we do have the database set up such that each PI and also PROPOLIS coordinating people are notified once an adverse event or an unanticipated problem is logged in REDCap. So those are only necessary if those events did occur. And if those events did occur, you'll want to make sure that you mark them at the time point that was closest to the time point that did occur. Either the adverse event, the serious adverse event, or the unanticipated problems log occurred. And you'll see that the data that we collect in REDCap mirrors the data that's asked for on the paper data collection form of the PROPOLIS user's manual for adverse event log and unanticipated problems log. So that is an overview of how to how to enter data into REDCap for a PROPOLIS participant. There's another video training for a PROPOLIS paper data collection form that provides you an overview of the paper data collection forms. And there's another one on using e-consent in REDCap. Thank you.